They had just moved into their new home, ready to start a beautiful new chapter. Sarah was pregnant, and the house, old but charming, seemed like the perfect place to raise their child. But what was supposed to be a time of joy quickly turned into something sinister. It all started with a simple choice, the name for their baby. The old house creaked under the weight of the wind outside. The living room, dimly lit by a flickering lamp, felt heavy with tension. Sarah, a woman in her late 20s with a noticeable baby bump, sat on the edge of the worn-out couch. Her hands rested on her stomach, as if trying to shield the unborn child from the storm brewing inside the room. Across from her stood her husband, Mark, his face twisted with anger. "I don't understand why you're so upset," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's just a name, Mark. We've been discussing this for weeks. Why is it such a big deal now?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding hers. "I don't know, Sarah. Every time you say that name, it's like something inside me snaps. I can't explain it. It just feels wrong." Sarah frowned, confusion and hurt written all over her face. She reached for a piece of paper on the coffee table, a list of names they had been considering for their baby. "Look, we've gone through so many options. You liked some of them, I liked others. But this one feels right to me. It's beautiful, Mark. Why can't you see that?" Mark's eyes fell on the list, and his jaw tightened. His gaze lingered on one name in particular, and his hands clenched into fists. "No, not that one. Anything but that one." Sarah's voice rose, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why? What's wrong with it? It's just a name, Mark. It's not like we're naming him after some criminal or something." Mark's face paled, and he took a step back as if her words had physically struck him. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "It's not just a name. It's something else. I can't explain it, but it feels like a bad omen." Before Sarah could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the curtains sway violently. The lamp on the side table flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Both of them froze, their argument momentarily forgotten as the atmosphere in the room shifted. Then, with a loud thud, an old book fell from one of the shelves. It landed on the floor, its pages splayed open. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the name she had chosen, written in bold faded letters on the yellowed page. Below it was a date, over 100 years ago, and a single line that sent a chill down her spine. "In loving memory of—" Mark's breath hitched, and he stumbled back, his face a mask of horror. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, no, no." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the book, her eyes scanning the page. The name, the date, the eerie coincidence. It was too much to process. She looked up at Mark, her voice shaking. "What is this? 'Tis. What's going on?" Mark didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the book, his face pale and drawn. The flickering light of the lamp made his expression seem even more haunted. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. The room fell silent, save for the sound of the wind outside and the faint creaking of the old house. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The name, the book, Mark's reaction. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. "Mark," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "Talk to me. Please. What's wrong?" But Mark didn't respond. He turned away from her, his shoulders tense, and walked out of the room without a word. Sarah was left alone, clutching the old book to her chest, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The flickering lamp finally went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah sat there, her heart pounding, as the weight of the unknown settled over her like a heavy blanket. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something in this house wasn't right. Sarah sat in the dark for what felt like an eternity, the old book still clutched in her hands. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant howl of the wind. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The name, the book, Mark's reaction. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Finally, she stood up, her legs shaky, and made her way to the hallway. The flickering light from the kitchen guided her steps. She found Mark standing by the sink, his back to her, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mark," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk about this. I don't understand what's going on, but we can't just ignore it." Mark didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, his breathing uneven. "I don't want to talk about it, Sarah," he said, his voice strained. "Just drop it, okay? Let's just forget it ever happened." Sarah's frustration flared. "Forget it? How can I forget it? That book fell open to the exact name we've been arguing about, and it's connected to someone who died over 100 years ago. Don't you think that's strange? Don't you think we need to figure out what's going on?" Mark finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and troubled. "You don't get it, Sarah. There are some things that are better left alone. This house, this place, it's not normal. I felt it since the day we moved in. And now this name." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't want to know more. I can't." Sarah took a step closer to him, her voice softening. "Mark, I'm scared too. But ignoring it won't make it go away. Whatever's happening, we need to face it together. For us, and for the baby." Mark's eyes flickered to her stomach, and for a moment, his expression softened. But then he looked away, his jaw tightening. "I can't, Sarah, I can't." Before she could respond, the sound of the front door slamming shut made them both jump. Sarah's heart raced as she turned toward the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "I'll check it out." Sarah shook her head. "No, I'm coming with you." They walked down the hallway together, the flickering light from the living room casting long shadows on the walls. The front door was closed, but the air felt colder, as if a draft had seeped into the house. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "Maybe it was just the wind," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes were drawn to the staircase, where a faint creaking sound echoed from above. She glanced at Mark, who was staring at the stairs with a look of dread. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark nodded, his face grim. "Stay here," he said again, but Sarah shook her head. "I'm not staying behind," she said firmly. "We're in this together, remember?" They climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under their weight. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time they reached the top, Sarah's teeth were chattering. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through a window at the far end. The creaking sound came again, this time from the room at the end of the hall, the nursery they had been preparing for the baby. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached the door, which was slightly ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to drift from inside. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Sarah," he began, but she cut him off. "Open it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Mark took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty, just as they had left it. The crib stood in the corner, the walls painted a soft yellow, and a small rocking chair sat by the window. But something felt off. The air was heavy, and the whispering sound was louder now, though no one was there. Sarah's eyes were drawn to the crib. She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached, she noticed something lying in the crib. A small, dusty teddy bear that hadn't been there before. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare right at her, and a chill ran down her spine. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling, Did you put this here?" Mark shook his head, his face pale. "No, I've never seen it before." Sarah reached out to pick up the teddy bear, but as her fingers brushed against it, the whispering sound stopped abruptly. The room fell silent and the air seemed to grow even colder. She pulled her hand back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice urgent. "Now!" Sarah didn't argue. They hurried out of the room and down the stairs, the sense of dread growing with every step. As they reached the bottom, the flickering light in the living room went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah fumbled for her phone. Turning on the flashlight, The beam of light illuminated the hallway, but it did little to dispel the fear that had settled over them. Mark grabbed her hand, his grip tight, and they made their way to the front door. But as they reached for the handle, the whispering sound returned louder this time. It seemed to come from all around them, filling the air with an eerie, almost mournful tone. Sarah's heart raced as she turned the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she said, her voice shaking. "Mark, it's locked." Mark tried the handle himself, but it was no use. The door was stuck, as if something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned around slowly, her flashlight illuminating the empty hallway. But for a brief moment, she thought she saw something. A shadow, small and fleeting, darting into the living room. Her breath caught in her throat and she gripped Mark's arm tightly. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Mark didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the living room, his face pale and drawn. The whispering sound faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "We need to find another way out," Mark said finally, his voice low and urgent. "Come on." They moved through the house quickly, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak, every shadow made Sarah's heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something or someone was watching them. As they reached the back door, Mark tried the handle and this time it opened. The cold night air hit them like a slap, but it was a welcome relief after the oppressive atmosphere inside. They stepped out into the yard, their breaths visible in the chilly air. Sarah turned to look back at the house, her heart still racing. The windows were dark, the house silent and still. But for a brief moment, she thought she saw a face, a small, pale face, peering out from one of the upstairs windows. She blinked, and it was gone. The night air was cold, but Sarah and Mark didn't dare go back inside the house. They stood in the backyard, their breaths visible in the moonlight, staring at the dark windows of their home. The sense of dread that had driven them outside still lingered, clinging to them like a second skin. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the thick sweater she wore. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his face pale and drawn. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't stay out here all night. It's freezing." Sarah glanced back at the house, her heart pounding. The thought of going back inside made her stomach churn, but Mark was right, they couldn't stay outside. The cold was already seeping into her bones, and she had to think of the baby. Maybe we can call someone," she suggested. "A friend, or the police. Something's not right in that house, Mark. We can't just pretend it's normal." Mark hesitated, his eyes darting toward the house. "And tell them what, that we're scared because a book fell off a shelf and a door got stuck? They'll think we're crazy." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything, the sound of the front door creaking open made them both freeze. They turned toward the house, their hearts racing, as a figure stepped out onto the porch. It was an old woman, her face lined with age, and her hair a wild tangle of grey. She wore a long, tattered coat and carried a cane, which she tapped lightly against the wooden floorboards as she walked. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Sarah and Mark, and a chill ran down Sarah's spine. Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice tense. "What are you doing here?" The old woman didn't answer right away. She descended the porch steps slowly, her movements deliberate, and stopped a few feet away from them. Her gaze swept over the house and a look of sadness crossed her face. "I've been waiting for you," she said finally, her voice low and raspy. "I knew you'd come." Sarah exchanged a confused glance with Mark. "What do you mean?" she asked. "We've never met you before." The old woman's eyes flickered to Sarah's stomach, and a faint smile touched her lips. "No, you haven't. But I know this house. I know what happened here." Mark took a step forward, his expression wary. "What are you talking about? What happened here?" The old woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of solemnity. "A long time ago, this house was home to a family, a mother, a father, and their little boy. They were happy for a time, but then something terrible happened. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old woman's gaze drifted to the house, her eyes distant. "The boy died," she said simply. "He was just a child, no more than 5 years old. They say it was an accident, but there were whispers that it wasn't an accident at all." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" The old woman turned to look at her, her eyes piercing. "They say the boy never left, that his spirit stayed behind, trapped in this house. And now he's found you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively placed a hand on her stomach. Mark's face paled, and he shook his head. "No, that's impossible. Ghosts aren't real." The old woman's smile was sad. "You've felt it, haven't you? The cold spots, the whispers, the things that move when no one's there. You've seen him." Sarah's mind flashed back to the shadow she'd seen in the hallway, the face in the window. Her hands trembled, and she clutched Mark's arm for support. What does he want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's expression darkened. "He wants what he lost, a family, a life, and now he's chosen you." Mark shook his head, his voice rising in anger. "This is insane. We're not listening to this. Sarah, let's go." He grabbed her arm and started to pull her toward the car, but Sarah hesitated. Her eyes were locked on the old woman, who stood silently, her gaze filled with pity. "Wait," Sarah said, pulling free from Mark's grip. If what you're saying is true, how do we stop it? How do we make him leave?" The old woman's expression softened. "You can't," she said quietly. "Not unless you uncover the truth. The boy's spirit is tied to this house, to the secrets it holds. If you want to be free, you'll have to face what happened here. But be warned, some truths are better left buried." Before Sarah could respond, the old woman turned and began to walk away, her cane tapping against the ground. Sarah took a step forward, wanting to call out to her, but Mark stopped her. "Let her go," he said, his voice firm. "She's just some crazy old woman trying to scare us. We're not falling for it." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the old woman's words had struck a chord. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more to the house, and as she looked back at the dark windows, she couldn't help but wonder if they were truly alone. The old woman's words lingered in Sarah's mind long after she had disappeared into the night. Mark tried to convince her that it was all nonsense, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth to what the woman had said. The strange occurrences in the house, the name in the old book, the shadowy figure. It all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't ignore. The next morning, Sarah woke up determined to find answers. Mark had left early for work, his mood still tense from the night before. Sarah knew he didn't want to talk about it, but she couldn't let it go. She needed to understand what was happening in their home, for her sake, for Mark's, and for their unborn child. She started in the attic, a place she had avoided since they moved in. The narrow staircase creaked under her weight as she climbed, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was dimly lit, with dust-covered boxes and old furniture scattered across the floor. A single beam of sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating the floating particles of dust in the air. Sarah began sifting through the boxes, her hands trembling as she opened each one. Most contained old clothes, books, and trinkets left behind by the previous owners. But in one corner, she found a small wooden chest, its surface worn and covered in a thick layer of dust. Her heart raced as she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and photographs. The first photograph showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little boy. They stood in front of the house, smiling, but there was something haunting about the image. The boy's eyes seemed to stare directly at her, his expression almost knowing. Sarah shivered and set the photo aside, turning her attention to the papers. They were old documents, birth certificates, letters, and newspaper clippings. One clipping caught her eye, its headline bold and jarring. "Tragedy strikes local family. Child dies in mysterious accident." Sarah's hands shook as she read the article. It detailed the death of a 5-year-old boy named Thomas, who had lived in the house over 100 years ago. The circumstances of his death were unclear, but the article mentioned that the family had moved away shortly after, leaving the house abandoned for decades. Sarah's breath quickened as she pieced together the story. The boy in the photograph, the name in the old book, the whispers and shadows, it all pointed to Thomas. But why was his spirit still here? What had happened to him? As she dug deeper, she found a letter tucked beneath the newspaper clippings. It was written in a shaky hand. The ink faded with time. Sarah's eyes scanned the words, her heart pounding with each sentence. To whoever finds this, I write this in the hope that one day the truth will come to light. My son Thomas was a bright and happy child. But something changed in him in the weeks before his death. He became withdrawn, fearful, and would often speak of a shadow man who visited him at night. I thought it was just a child's imagination, but now I fear it was something more. The night he died, I heard him crying in his room. When I went to check on him, I found him standing by the window, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He said the shadow man was coming for him. Before I could reach him, he fell. The window was open, and he just slipped. I don't know what happened that night, but I know it wasn't an accident. Something in this house took my son, and I fear it's still here. If you're reading this, please, be careful. Thomas's spirit may not be at rest, and the shadow man may still linger. With a heavy heart, Eleanor. Sarah's hands trembled as she set the letter down. Her mind raced, trying to process what she had just read. The shadow man, Thomas's death, the warnings. It was all too much. She felt a cold breeze sweep through the attic, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "is that you? Are you here?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint whisper echoed through the attic, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "Help me." Sarah's heart raced, and she scrambled to her feet, clutching the letter to her chest. She needed to tell Mark. He had to believe her now. She hurried down the stairs, her mind spinning with questions and fear. When Mark returned home that evening, Sarah was waiting for him in the living room, the letter and photograph in her hands. He looked exhausted, his face drawn, but his expression hardened when he saw what she was holding. "Sarah, we've been over this," he said, his voice tense. "I don't want to talk about it." "You need to see this," she insisted, holding out the letter. "It's about the boy, Thomas. He died here, Mark. And I think his spirit is still here. He's trying to tell us something." Mark hesitated, his eyes flickering to the letter. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, but then he sighed and took it from her. He read it in silence, his face growing paler with each word. When he finished, he set the letter down and ran a hand through his hair. "This doesn't prove anything," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just an old letter. It doesn't mean there's a ghost in the house." "Mark, listen to me," Sarah said, her voice pleading. "I heard him in the attic. I heard him whisper. He said, 'Help me.' We can't ignore this. We have to do something." Mark looked at her, his expression conflicted. "And what do you suggest we do? Call a priest? Hold a séance? This isn't a horror movie, Sarah. This is our home." "I don't know," Sarah cried, her frustration boiling over. "But we can't just pretend nothing's happening. If Thomas's spirit is here, if he's trapped, we have to help him. For our sake and for the baby's." Mark was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Okay, we'll figure something out. But I still think this is crazy." Sarah felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Together, they began to plan their next steps, unaware that the shadow man was watching and waiting. The days that followed were tense. Sarah and Mark tried to go about their lives as normally as possible, but the house seemed to grow more restless with each passing day. Doors would slam shut on their own, the temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, and the whispering sounds became more frequent. Sarah could feel Thomas's presence everywhere, a constant, unsettling reminder that they were not alone. One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of faint crying. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and glanced at Mark, who was still asleep beside her. The crying was soft, almost like a child's whimper, and it seemed to be coming from the nursery. Sarah hesitated, her instincts telling her to stay in bed, but her concern for the baby overruled her fear. She slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under her feet. The nursery door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from inside. Her breath caught in her throat as she pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the rocking chair by the window was moving slowly back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. The crying sound had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Thomas?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you here?" There was no response, but the air in the room felt heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the boy. The crib was empty, the toys neatly arranged, but something felt off. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor near the crib. A small, dusty teddy bear, its glassy eyes staring up at her. It was the same bear she had seen in the crib days earlier. Her heart raced as she picked it up, her fingers brushing against its worn fur. "Sarah?" Mark's voice came from the doorway, startling her. She turned to see him standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide with concern. "What are you doing in here?" I heard crying," she said, holding up the teddy bear. "And I found this. It's the same one from before." Mark's expression darkened. "Sarah, this has to stop. You're letting your imagination run wild. There's no one here. No ghost, no crying child. It's just an old house." Sarah shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're not listening, Mark. I'm not imagining this. Something is happening in this house, and we need to face it." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, if it'll make you feel better, we'll look into it. But after that, we're done. No more ghost stories, no more late-night searches." "Agreed." Sarah nodded, though she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The next day they began their search for answers. They started in the basement, a place they had rarely ventured since moving in. The air was damp and cold, and the flickering light bulb cast long shadows across the cluttered space. Among the old furniture and boxes, Sarah found a small trunk tucked away in a corner. It was covered in dust, but the lock was broken, and the lid opened easily. Inside, she found a collection of children's clothes, toys, and a small leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened the journal, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It was Thomas's journal, filled with drawings and short entries about his life. The last few pages were the most chilling. "The shadow man comes at night. He stands in the corner of my room and watches me. I told Mama, but she doesn't believe me. She says it's just a bad dream, but I know he's real. He wants to take me away." Sarah's breath quickened as she read the words, her heart pounding in her chest. She flipped to the last entry, dated the day before Thomas's death. "I'm scared. The shadow man says he's coming for me tonight. I don't want to go with him. I don't want to leave Mama and Papa, but he says I don't have a choice." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she closed the journal. She looked at Mark, who had been silently watching her, his face pale. "He was scared," she said, her voice breaking. "He knew something was coming for him, and now he's trapped here." Mark didn't respond. He looked shaken, his usual skepticism replaced by a look of unease. For the first time, Sarah thought he might actually believe her. As they left the basement, Sarah felt a strange sense of determination. She didn't know how, but she was going to help Thomas. She couldn't let his spirit suffer any longer. The days that followed were a blur of research and preparation. Sarah and Mark spent hours poring over old records, talking to locals, and even consulting a historian who specialized in the area. They learned more about Thomas and his family, but the details of his death remained shrouded in mystery. The only thing that was clear was that the Shadow Man, whoever or whatever he was, had been a part of Thomas's life in the weeks leading up to his death. Sarah became convinced that the Shadow Man was the key to freeing Thomas's spirit. If they could confront him, if they could understand what he wanted, maybe they could put an end to the haunting. Mark was still skeptical, but he could see how much this meant to Sarah, and he agreed to help her. One night they decided to hold a vigil in the nursery. They lit candles, placed Thomas's journal and teddy bear on the floor, and sat together, waiting. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just as Sarah was beginning to lose hope, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly and the candles flickered. "Sarah," Mark whispered, his voice tense. "Do you feel that?" She nodded, her heart racing. The whispering sound began faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Then, in the corner of the room, a shadow began to form. It was tall and dark, its shape shifting and twisting, as if it were alive. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the shadow man stepped forward, his featureless face somehow radiating malice. "Thomas," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. "We're here to help you. You don't have to be afraid anymore." The shadow man let out a low, guttural growl, and the room seemed to shake. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah felt a cold hand grip her arm, and she screamed, struggling to break free. "Let her go," Mark shouted, his voice filled with anger. He grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it at the shadow man. The shadow dissipated momentarily, but it quickly reformed, its attention now focused on Mark. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She remembered the old woman's words. Some truths are better left buried. But she also remembered Thomas's journal, his fear, his plea for help. She knew what she had to do. "Thomas," she called out, her voice strong despite her fear. "We know what happened to you. We know about the shadow man. But you don't have to stay here anymore. You can be at peace." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint light began to glow in the corner of the room. It grew brighter, and the shadow man let out a deafening roar, his form writhing and twisting as if in pain. The light enveloped him, and with a final, ear-splitting scream, he vanished. The room fell silent, the air warm once more. Sarah and Mark stood there, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding. Then, from the corner of the room, a small figure appeared. It was Thomas, his face pale, but no longer fearful. He looked at Sarah and smiled, a soft, peaceful smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then he faded away, the light dimming until the room was dark once more. Sarah sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Mark knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. The house was quiet after that. The strange occurrences stopped, and the atmosphere felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. Sarah and Mark still didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew one thing for certain. Thomas was finally at peace. They decided to stay in the house, turning it into a home filled with love and light. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy a few months later, and they named him Thomas in honor of the boy who had once lived there. As the years passed, the memories of that night faded, but Sarah never forgot the little boy who had needed their help. And sometimes, on quiet nights, she would swear she felt a gentle presence in the nursery, watching over her son with a smile. The shadow man was gone, and the house was finally free. But the love and courage that had driven Sarah and Mark to face their fears remained, a testament to the power of family and the strength of the human spirit. If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from. It helps this channel grow more than you know. Have a nice day.